The Dragon and the George by Dickson. Book review. Okay, so before I talk about this book, actually, I want to talk about the movie that's based off of it, because that was my point of entry to this book. So this book was the basis of a movie called Flight of Dragons. The movie was originally made in 1982, and according to Wikipedia, was released as a kind of a direct-to-video production. It was done by Rankin Bass, and it was kind of done in the same style as their Hobbit movies, if you've seen those. So they not the recent Hobbit movies, but you know the ones from the late 70s, early 80s. They did The Hobbit, and then they did Return of the King. I grew up with those movies as a kid. I saw them off the Disney Channel. We taped it onto VHS, and it was kind of one of those movies watched over and over and over again as a kid. I had everything memorized. Flight of Dragons I didn't see quite as much, but I remember seeing it at least a couple times as a kid. The first time I saw it was when it was on the ABC Sunday Night Movie. Now, ABC Sunday Night Movie, I don't think they still do this, but this was a big deal in the early 80s. Every Sunday night they kind of show a movie. It would usually be like a special movie. And of course this was in the days before the internet and before VHS was kind of widely popular. So, you know, if there was a movie being shown on TV, it was like a big deal, because, you know, you couldn't just watch whatever you wanted to all the time back in those days. Usually, I think the ABC Sunday Night Movie would start from 8 o'clock, but one time they showed Flight of Dragons, and because it was a cartoon movie kind of aimed more towards kids, it started at 7 o'clock. And I remember my parents didn't usually let me watch the ABC Sunday Night Movie, but they let me watch it that night. And it's Rankin Bass production, and it's very similar in style and animation to their kind of Hobbit movies. So same kind of animation style, same kind of epic feel, same kind of soundtrack, and kind of folk songs being sung over it, and kind of dramatic music and kind of all that stuff. I thought the movie was not without its flaws, and I remember even as a kid, there were some parts that were a little bit strange. If you've seen the movie, I think you'll know what those are. But kind of in general tone and general atmosphere and general kind of world building, I was fascinated by it. And it again, it was kind of in the same style as those Hobbit movies. So those movies together kind of symbolized to me what I kind of thought epic fantasy was. And then, you know, you kind of grow up and you forget about it until the internet comes along, and then there's Wikipedia and YouTube and everything is online. And so I stumbled across a copy of Flight of Dragons on YouTube. Somebody had uploaded it years ago. It's been taken down a long time ago because it was in violation of the copyright. But I watched it, and you know, again, for all its flaws, I remember just kind of this feeling I had as a kid of being caught up in this epic fantasy. And you know, everybody knows what The Hobbit is based on, right? The Hobbit and the Return of the King, those old Rankin Bass cartoons, are based on J.R.R. Tolkien's book. But like, what is Flight of Dragons based off of, right? And if you wanted to read the book, what would it be? Well, fortunately, we have Wikipedia. So I went to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia said that the movie is loosely based, actually it's loosely based off of two books. One is called Flight of Dragons, which I've not read it, but apparently it's not a novel, it's kind of a book theorizing about how dragons could actually fly with some illustrations. So apparently none of the story actually came from that book, but some of the art design did. And then the other one was The Dragon and the George by Dickson, which I think is, I mean, I've never really heard of this outside of like it being referenced as a source for Flight of Dragons. I think it's fairly obscure, but fortunately, we live in a day and age where it's never been easier to track down obscure books. I'm sure you could order it off of Amazon. What I did is I ended up getting it through interlibrary loan. I mean, you can get anything through interlibrary loan. Now, it's interesting, it's always interesting kind of when you encounter the movie first and you go back to the book. Because you have kind of this idea of what like the tone and the characters and should be like and stuff like that. And even though the book came first, kind of sometimes you're resistant to it if your kind of first point of contact with this material was from the movie. You're like, no, that wasn't the way it was in the movie. This book is completely different than the movie. Some of the character names are the same, but basically it's just a completely different story. And the tone is so different. You know, that Rankin Bass was such like an epic fantasy feel. And they had kind of all that epic fantasy music and stuff like that. This book is kind of like a comedy, but it's also, it doesn't really, so it's like humorous, so that's kind of the first adjustment. But it doesn't really have an immersive fantasy feel at all. In fact, the book starts off in kind of modern day, following the adventures of a guy named Jim Eckhart, who's a graduate student in medieval studies. And so, you know, right away, the book is kind of a very ordinary, mundane feeling. It's not like this epic fantasy. We're following Jim Eckhart around as he has the problem of graduate students. He's looking for housing. He's trying to secure a teaching position. He's dealing with the internal politics of the history department. And then eventually the plot does kick in. So Jim has a fiancée whose name is Angie. Now she is sent back in time during a science experiment gone wrong. And so Jim goes back in time after her. And somehow he ends up in the body of a dragon called Gorbash. Now, the same thing happened in the film, like the human character ends up in the dragon's body. In the film, there's kind of an explanation about to what happened. You know, it's a little bit, it's kind of cartoon logic to a certain extent. I think that, I don't remember exactly what happens. Maybe the dragon gets hit by lightning while he's carrying the human character. But there's some sort of like animated sequence of events which kind of explains to you what's going on. In the book, there's just no explanation. He's just travels back in time and for some reason ends up in the body of the dragon Gorbash. So also, it's never really clear in the book what's going on. I mean, it's presented as time travel, but then they end up in a fantasy world. And you're like, well, so did they travel back in time and to another universe? Or, I don't know, the main character, Jim, or Jim and Angie, never kind of indicate that anything is wrong with kind of this fantasy past. So I don't know, maybe in their universe the past was fantasy. Although that doesn't, I don't know. Anyways, they get sent back into this fantastical past. Now a lot of the characters from the movie are in the book. Same kind of characters and character names. But the plot is completely different. Actually, there's not much of a plot at all in the novel. There's simply a quest to save Angie from the dark powers, and then various excursions, side quests are thrown in. A lot of the characters do illogical things at various points, presumably just for the point of advancing the story. Now, a lot of the kind of standard characters from fantasy novels are presented in the novel in one form or another. There's a knight, a mage, a bullman. There's a Robin Hood type character. I mean, they don't call him Robin Hood, but they might as well. There's talking animals. There's a beautiful, scantily clad women. And of course, there's dragons. The novel's supposed to be a humorous novel. It made me smile at points, didn't really make me laugh. In short, I wouldn't recommend anyone go out of their way to read this book. I kind of mark it down only as so-so myself. But it wasn't the worst thing I've read either.